Pablo, thank you so much for joining us today. The first thing that I'd like to ask you is, could you tell us about yourself and your journey to this point?
So I started, professionally speaking, with a deep interest in philosophy, in normative theory, both politics and moral theory. I was born in Colombia and in a very involved family, and therefore had always a very deep sense of social responsibility. So I finished my PhD in philosophy and started teaching for many years. Academic philosophy, I think, in the Anglo-American world has become a very, very technical and very removed discipline, which felt to me like a sophisticated game, a very interesting game, but a game in the literal sense of an activity that has no consequences beyond its own borders. That's what a game is. And I thought that academic philosophy was a bit like that, and I didn't want to spend my whole life playing games. So I started keeping a dual research track, one on theoretical issues and one on issues that connected me with topics of social concern. And I started doing research, for example, on drug policy, which of course affected Colombia deeply, issues on human rights, and eventually, after I was tenured, I was asked by a then newly established NGO in New York whether I would help them set up the research department on transitional justice. This was the first NGO specifically devoted to transitional justice. So I took a leave of absence from the university, and that was 22 years ago. So eventually I resigned my teaching position and started devoting myself fully to the intersection between normative theory and policy making in the area of transitional justice, dealing with countries that were trying to address a problematic human rights past. Then I was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council as the first special rapporteur on transitional justice, a position that I held for 6 years. I did a few more things, special rapporteur for the United Nations, and I am currently part of the independent UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. But my path through this had a lot to do both with an interest in the intersection between theory and practice, to put it that way, but mostly with a sense that, to use the old cliche that one should try to do one's best to leave the world slightly better than one finds it. And this is what I've been doing for the last 30 years.
What does the day of international criminal justice mean to you?
Look, I think so because I have been working for 30 years in countries that are trying to deal with a problematic past concerning human rights and respect for the rights of others. There is sufficient evidence, both experiential but much more importantly scientific, to put it that way, that one of the problems that needs to be addressed is the huge problem of total impunity, and that there is such a thing as cycles of violence that need to be interrupted. And perhaps the best means that we know about how to do this is through a combination of formal justice systems that have a criminal component, But in addition to that, other policies to address other dimensions of justice that are not specifically addressed by criminal justice. So, for example, the criminal justice system in no functional country functions in isolation from other mechanisms of social support, education, health, employment opportunities, etc. But nevertheless, the criminal justice system is an important part of justice, is an important part of what I think is one of the main purposes of the search for justice, which is the affirmation of norms. We punish people, from my perspective, not so much for deterrent purposes, not so much for reasons of research, although both of them are important and, of course, figure prominently in the literature. I think that the most important objective of punishment has to do with an expressive act, the affirmation that there are certain norms that should not be violated because they are absolutely fundamental to the idea of equality, to the idea of a sense that we are common participants in a shared political project. And you cannot have that if there are people who think that the rules are just for the others. And normally, this also has a power dynamic involved in it, that the powerful think that the rules apply just to the powerless. And that, of course, undermines any sense of equality or of what Nancy Fraser, for example, called peers, in the sense that we are peers in a shared political project. So this, for me, is absolutely fundamental. I think that people, Enlightenment writers, were correct that the great challenge that we always face is how to overcome the condition under which some people have to assume the position of supplicants. For me, this is at the core of my efforts. No one should suffer the indignity of being put in a position of being a supplicant. It's a question of respect for the shared dignity of human beings. And therefore, this day is one day to recall the importance of all the instruments that we can use in order to guarantee a certain basic sense of equality.
Could you tell us about the different aspects of your work?
I expressed before my passion has a lot to do with issues at the intersection between normative theory and policy making. I think that because everyone approaches their experience with some conception of what fairness or justice calls for, even if there is no explicit articulation or let alone a theoretical articulation. Everyone has a sense of what is owed to him or her. And that is a normative understanding of fairness or of justice. And part of the well functioning of institutions of justice and of rights has to do precisely with the match between the normative expectations and the reality that the institutions try to guarantee. And I think that whenever there is a huge mismatch between the expectations and the reality, the institutional offer, to put it in those terms, there are dissonances that translate into different types of dysfunctionalities. one of which is precisely impunity. So my part of my great interest has to do with how to guarantee that policy making is informed by correct understandings of justice, and on the other hand, how our normative thinking about justice is adequately informed by the institutional realities and the institutional capacities with which we try to make those understandings of justice real. Because again, you need the expectations and the institutional offer to match one another.
How crucial are justice and the rule of law going to be in relation to humanity's survival?
Oh, I think that justice and human rights are, and the rule of law more broadly, are absolutely indispensable. Felix Frankfurter, an former justice of the American Supreme Court, has a beautiful passage in his autobiography saying that what keeps us from savagery is respect for the law. I think that this is absolutely essential for our survival. And I am not talking just about physical survival, of course. Part of my work has to do with the countries that have fallen off a cliff and have fallen into systemic violence. And there, of course, the lack of respect for the rule of law, for human rights, and for justice in general translate into the impossibility of physical survival. I think that more broadly, the rule of law, human rights, formal justice systems are critical for, to borrow from Pavese, the Italian author, who once said that he believed that human beings would not only endure, but that they will prevail. And if we are going to prevail, that is, if we're going to sustain ourselves in a civilized manner, and by that I mean one in which people respect one another, and again, in which people have legitimate reasons to think of themselves as equal participants in a shared political project. If no one is going to be put in the position of the supplicant, there is absolutely no way of achieving that without respect for the rule of law, without respect for human rights, and in the absence of a formal justice system to adjudicate conflicts. So for me, this is absolutely at the core of our survival in conditions that are not only of physical endurance, but of survival as a species whose members have some reason to talk about dignity and to talk about equal respect.
Could you give us an example of justice and the rule of law having a profound and inspirational impact in relation to humanity's survival?
I think that I would like to answer that question at two different levels. One, by making a very general reflection and to recollect what it meant for levels of violence to create formal institutions of justice, which of course was a long historical process, but which resulted in general in a very, very significant diminution of violence, and this has been very well documented. So I think that just keeping in mind the long history of the institutionalization of justice is worth doing in order, among other things, to go through the blips, because of course no historical curve is a simple ascending smooth curve, but there are ups and downs. We may be living through one of those throws, in fact, right now. So it's good to remember the long historical trends in order not to get too disappointed when things are not going well. But of course, and this is my second point, there are plenty of examples that one can use of countries emerging from violence and very deep forms of injustices that have tried to come to grips with the past. Again, a process which is fraught, which is never perfect, which is never complete, but that nevertheless produces deep results. I think, for example, that Germany, Chile, South Africa, none of which has been able to address its past perfectly, have nevertheless made huge strides in that process. And as a consequence, people in those countries and the people that have to relate to those countries have a significantly different relationship with them than those that have not gone through a similar process. And I want to point out that there is a sort of continued indignity and grievance in the lack of recognition of the problematic past. People do not forget. Cannot forget certain experiences of abuse that they have had to endure. If you think, for example, about Spain, the issue about dealing with the past in Spain has not gone away. And just 4 months ago, the government adopted a new law, the so-called democratic memory law. But this is more than 70 years after the end of the Civil War, more than 30 years after the end of the dictatorship, and the claims are still arising, mostly by grandchildren of the original victims. And that is a perfect demonstration of the fact that people do not forget, and that the sense of grievance that they carry is a generational inheritance, something that has been transmitted from generation to generation. And this, for me, is one of the reasons why it is absolutely urgent to make sure that the past is addressed adequately, because it is also a very well documented fact that trauma is transmitted intergenerationally. My understanding of Burundian politics, for example, and I did quite a bit of work on Burundi, was totally changed when I learned that in the ruling council of the party in power, the CNDD, all the members were people whose parents had been murdered in previous rounds of violence. It is impossible not to be affected by experiences of this sort. And as a consequence, the idea that the CNDD would behave as a conventional political party, as if this had not happened before, was completely unrealistic. And of course, history has borne out the difficulties. Therefore, I think that justice is not an irrelevant part of our expectations of what a human life should be like. And there are both successes and failures. But the main point is A, that this is an urgent task, and B, that despite the difficulties and the imperfections, there are countries that have succeeded in achieving a modicum of justice, even regarding some of the worst abuses and violations that we have done.
Given the state of the world, do you have hope that we can still survive?
Listen, this is a very important question, and I have to acknowledge that it is a very difficult one because it is easy, given the state of the world right now, to fall into despair. I, however, have always felt that for anyone who aspires to make a contribution to improving the world, at least in the domain of justice, it is important to avoid two extremes. On the one hand, a sort of romantic spirit that thinks that the world is easy to improve, that it only depends on an act of will, that if we only replaced a few leaders, everything would automatically be better, that we could move into utopia easily and without long processes of transformation. I think that that sort of romanticism is dangerous, not the least, because it has never been borne out in historical experiences, not even through revolutions that create injustices of their own. On the other hand, I also feel that it is important to avoid the opposite extreme, which is one of a certain type of cynicism, a cynicism that says that it is not even worth trying, that the world is so messed up that why bother? I think that in between romanticism and cynicism, there is a wide space in which to work and doing the hard work of slow institutional transformation, slow cultural change, slow changes in economic conditions, slow changes right now of an urgent type concerning taking better care of the environment. None of this will happen overnight. But on the other hand, falling into cynicism will guarantee that none of those changes will ever take place. Falling into romanticism, I think, diminishes the likelihood of the long haul actually being sustainable, and very likely leads to defeated expectations that will quickly move from romanticism to cynicism. And therefore, occupying that space in the middle seems to me fundamental to me. And I find that that is a space in which hope can take root and can both incentivize action and manifest itself through action.
What advice would you give to a young person who's thinking of going into a legal or rights and justice profession?
I have two bits of advice, if I may. One is to try to occupy this space between romanticism on the one hand and cynicism on the other, not to despair with the defeat. The lawyer who, for example, presented the largest number of cases, of habeas corpus cases during the dictatorship in Chile, it took him about 30 years for a court to hear any of his cases. And of course, during those 30 years, he often asked himself, Augusto, his name, how are you doing? He would pose the question to himself. And he would say, lousy. I have been doing this for 30 years and I haven't had a single case heard by a court. Well, he now has the largest number of cases before courts, some of them now decided against former perpetrators. So there's a type of endurance and resilience in the type of work and in his attitude that I think is very important. And that, of course, is an expression of someone who was not a romantic at all. He didn't think that the presentation of the first case or the fifth or the 10th or the 15th would lead to a quick success. He persisted for 30 years, presenting hundreds of petitions that were dismissed by courts for decades. And of course, he avoided cynicism. And he just kept on going with a firm belief that eventually a court will be willing to hear one of his cases. And now courts have heard more than 400 of his cases. So I would suggest, again, that it is very important to maintain oneself in a space that avoids extremes of romanticism or of cynicism. The second bit of advice is that I think that it is very important for lawyers and people who work in the justice-related areas, including human rights, to think about the law not as a conversation stopper, but as the expression of an argument that at one point was made, but that cannot be forgotten. In other words, there is an underlying normative rationale for lawmaking that every once in a while needs to be revisited if the law is going to be kept alive. It is very common for lawyers to think that what they do because this is what the law requires. But of course, that is an insufficient argument in many ways. And it is an argument that, by the way, makes legal improvements much less likely. So keeping alive the underlying reasons why laws are articulated and adopted, I think is important just to make sure that we are on the right track, because even the law, as we know very, very well, can go wrong in many cases.
Is there anything that individuals can do to support justice and the strong rule of law?
I have always been very deeply convinced of the correctness of Martin Luther King saying that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. In other words, that we are truly, in this sense, connected to one another, and that failing to acknowledge that is, in a certain sense, a sign of disrespect for the humanity of others. So yes, I think that the way that one lives one life at many different levels, as a citizen, as a person in relation with others, both strangers and people in one's close circle, that in all those spheres, it is always possible to manifest either a sense of solidarity or indifference, and that translates into choices that one makes regarding voting, regarding consumption, regarding listening to one another regarding being present or absent from people in need, and again, at different degrees of remove or proximity from one's immediate circle. And therefore, I mean, I think that there is no sphere of life in which one cannot do something in order to express a sense of solidarity and respect. And of course, in each sphere, it will be manifested differently, but that I think that this is one of the very, very basic manifestations of our obligations to one another, just to make sure that in every sphere of our life, we manifest that sense of solidarity and that sense of respect for the humanity and the dignity of others.
How can people support your work, and where do we find more information?
So there are different dimensions to my work. My main work for the last few years has been precisely on a project to prevent massive human rights violations. And this is a global project involving 160 academics and practitioners, totally globally dispersed. So it's not a project about the North teaching the South how to conduct its own business. And the North also has very severe problems about how to prevent falling off pretty dangerous cliffs that we are approaching fast and much more closely than in the last 20 years. Information about that project can be easily gotten through the website of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University. And then there is my work with the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, information about which can be gotten through the website of OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN. And there is an independent site for the Ukraine Commission. And I think that the best way to support that sort of work for the average person who is not directly involved in this topic is to care enough to remain informed and eventually to make their views known in all sorts of circles, again, because I think that we have gotten too used to thinking about an isolation of spheres as if the different aspects of our lives were completely disconnected from one another. But I think that the conversations that we have with friends, for example, have an impact on the way that we engage in the public sphere, and that the way that we engage in the public sphere, of course, has an impact on the way that our political systems work. So everything is interconnected. Ian Forster's epigraph in Howard's End, "Only connect," I think is a brilliant description of a sort of obligation that human beings have towards one another. And therefore, I would apply it more generally and in response to your question. People can help justice and human rights related work by only connecting, making sure that they live their lives across the whole range of spheres in which human beings participate in a way that is aware of the connections and the consequences and the spillovers from sphere to sphere, including consumption, including voting behavior, including awareness of the space in which we live in. This is important, and it's a way of making the world better. Not everyone can turn into a human rights activist, but everyone can contribute to improving justice in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck with all of your incredible work.